welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us once again. And welcome to our YouTube viewers. Please don't forget to subscribe, if you haven't already, to our YouTube channel to get all our updates as soon as they're available. And can I give you our usual reminder to consider making a charity donation instead of a registration fee, which we don't charge. Charities, as you know, that we support include the combined charities, NHS, Just Giving Page and Shelter. But as always, feel free to donate to a charity of your choice if you wish to do so instead. Now, we're thrilled this week that our special guest is none other than the Minister for Planning and Housing himself, the Right Honourable Chris Pincher MP. As many of you will know, our LinkedIn page called for your questions to ask the Minister so we can grill him about the issues that matter the most to you. And that's what we're going to be doing shortly. Now, due to a short notice debate in Parliament today, he's had to pre-record our interview. That's probably the best excuse any of our guests will have, I think, for doing that. We'll be showing that with you in the second half of the show, never before seen by the world. We had a fascinating chat with him yesterday evening, which we're really looking forward to sharing. And I think you're going to really enjoy it, actually. Now, Mr. Pincher's constituency is Tamworth, and our theme is Honour of That Fine Place. So fear not, I haven't stepped outside for the second week, Money. I'm still recovering from the effects of hypothermia last week. Chris, you're off to the Tamworth Snowdome, I think, Chris. I remember loved many fun days as a Brummy school kid at the Brown Hills. I think it's Brown Hills Shopping Centre up in Tamworth. Anyway, let's more of that in due course. But in the meantime, let's introduce the panel, starting as always with Mary. Once again in your fine gallery, as I call it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Charlie. And yes, I'm back in the gallery for the purposes of this part of the show. In any event, and I'm on the tea. And I'm afraid to say that I ate my Tamworth pig sausage rolls for lunch. I couldn't resist, but I meant to save them for the show, but I failed.
Yes, that's the Tamworth pig. I must say, given longer notice, I might have tried to acquire a real live pig in the ever one-upmanship between ourselves as to our theme. But there we go. Paul, I'm assuming that's not the Eton Rowing Lake, but something to do with Tamworth, and you're going to tell me what it is.
Yes, Charlie. When I was back in 1996, when I was a baby barrister, I had my first ever big case south of Tamworth, where I got consent for the drag ski, water ski lift you would have seen on the gravel pit directly behind me, which is now run as the Cliff Lake and Aqua Park. So I got permission for this when I was a mere baby barrister, and it's about 5 miles south of Tamworth. However, I can't betray my native Yorkshire, so I'm drinking something from Naylor's Brewery called Yorkshire, which is brewed in Yorkshire, and it's made in Yorkshire, if there's any doubt at all. But that's my link to Tamworth.
Brewed especially for you.
Good. Hello, Charlie. It's very disconcerting seeing you actually be in a sensible place for a programme.
Exactly.
We had reserved the viewing platform, the Shard, for you this week. But, I'm in London. I am very excited. It's actually almost the most exciting day of the year for me, because we've got England playing 2020, Arsenal playing at 6 o'clock, and Rangers at 8. So I'm like a pig in whatever you call it.
Chris?
I was just going to say, Paul, I bet that beer is actually brewed in Amsterdam. I bet.
Tastes like Yorkshire beer.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm in the middle of my inquiry. Well, second week of my inquiry. I've got JCB helping me, and I'm against Hugh Richards. And it's all very tiring at home. Yes, I am paying homage to somewhere that I love to go, which is the Tamworth Snowdome. Growing up, you could go skiing on the Gloucester dry ski slope, which was like skiing on bristles, because it is skiing on bristles and it hurts. Or you could go to the Snowdome where they got real snow. It was amazing. It was the biggest thing that happened to my life in the 80s. So I'm paying homage to Tamworth, and Presumption behind me is on his skis. Doesn't he look good?
He does indeed. Well, cheers, Chris. Well, Charlie Banner here from Keating Chambers. In Tamworth, the backdrop, and I'm drinking a beer from Yorkshire too. I promised that a couple of weeks ago I'd open up my Atom beer that John Edmund recommended to me, brewed in Hull. They have an outlet in East Riding, Yorkshire, and it's called Fruited Sour. If you can see it there, it's rather nice, actually.
Charlie, the H is silent.
Boom. Now, I've got a really easy job because we pre-recorded the interview, which I did, and the rest of you are doing the case summaries this week. I can just sit back and drink beer and call you on. And the first one of you that I'm going to call on to tell us about a case is Mary, and you're going to tell us about Court Appeals judgment in the Brahms Hill case.
I am, thank you very much. Yes, this is the wonderful Lord Justice Limblom giving the judgment in the Brahms Hill case. And this is an appeal that some of you might recognise because I think we dealt with it first time round. And this is a challenge on basically two grounds. The first ground related to the application of 195 and 196 in the MPPF. In other words, we're in the territory of designated heritage assets and how you assess them. And the second point related to paragraph 79 of the MPPF and isolated homes in the countryside. Before we get to those 2 points, just by way of a preamble, so this is a 31st of January 29 inspector's decision. Unusual, 33 appeals the inspector was grappling with. Some were planning appeals, some were enforcement appeals, and an inquiry that sat for 26 days. I mean, can you imagine that? Now, that seems like yesteryear, doesn't it? And the Historic England and the National Trust were also involved in the inquiry, and the National Trust was involved and appeared in the Court of Appeal, Melissa Murphy acting for the National Trust. The site was a former police college training centre. It's set in 106 hectares, and it was a grade 1 listed Jacobean mansion. And basically the development was to achieve a change of use, residential, and all sorts of new buildings in the grounds for, guess what, residential development. So that's the background. With regard to the heritage point, the appellants suggested that the approach taken by the inspector was inappropriate because the appellant suggested that there had to be something they described as an internal heritage balance that should be undertaken by the inspector, where the elements of heritage harm and heritage benefits were weighed to establish whether there was any overall heritage harm to the proposal. So that's what that was the contention that they were advocating. And both Historic England and the National Trust, in their evidence to the inquiry, had said that paragraph 195 and 196 would always be engaged where there was any element of harm. So those were the sort of rival contentions. And the appellants were relying on a case called Palmer, another Court of Appeal case, which they said was the basis for their proposition of law. Well, Limblom said that he could not accept that submission. And he said this: it is not stipulated or implied in section 66(1) or in the relevant case law that a decision maker must undertake a net or internal balance of heritage related benefits and harm as a self-contained exercise preceding a wider assessment of any kind of the kind envisaged in paragraph 196, nor is there any justification, he said, for reading a requirement into the MPPF in such a way. And so that was the end of the first point. So the second point was concerning the expression isolated homes in the countryside. And you'll all remember that this was a subject that was covered by the Court of Appeal in the Braintree decision. That case was looking at paragraph 55, as it then was in the 2012 MPPF. And the outcome of that case was that basically whether or not a proposed dwelling was isolated was a matter of planning judgment. And the decision maker would also need to have a look and see what it was isolated from. Was it a village? Was it a settlement? Was it a community? And the point was made that, again, that's a planning judgment, and these expressions are not defined in the MPPF. In this particular case, the appellant relied on another case called Dartford. In Dartford, they were concerned with the definition of previously developed land. And in that case, the judge referred to a dwelling in a curtilage sitting in the curtilage of another, not being isolated, because of course you'll be in the curtilage of a dwelling. And basically the appellants were arguing in the Brahms Hill case that there was a conflict with Dartford, and that's something that the inspector hadn't grappled with, even though, to be fair to the inspector, they'd never referred the Dartford case to her. Anyway, the Court of Appeal said, Lindblom said, no, that was an obiter comment of the Court of Appeal in the Dartford case. There was absolutely no conflict between that and the way the inspector approached the issue of isolated dwellings in this particular case, where, after all, what the appellant was seeking to do was dot, as it were, a variety of new homes in the grounds. And the argument was they couldn't possibly be isolated because they were all close to each other, as it were. And the inspector found that, of course, the whole thing was isolated from the nearest large settlement. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. Important judgment. Now, next up, we're travelling to the world's greatest city, are we not, Chris?
We are indeed.
And you're going to tell us all about the Camp Hill Birmingham decision.
I am indeed. This is a Secretary of State decision issued on the 8th of March. And if we just bring that up on the screen, Rob's doing that. You can see it's a decision of Inspector Jenny Vise, who held a public inquiry back in October. Birmingham City Council refused the application. It was for 480 homes, a hotel, a flexible business commercial units, and car parking, etc. And you'll see at the bottom, the Secretary of State agreed with the inspector's conclusion and decided to grant planning permission. So this is against the City Council's wishes. Now, if we want to see what the case is about, it's a very simple point, and it's the fact that this site lay potentially in the route of what's called a rail cord that connects two lines. So there's the Chiltern line and the Camp Hill line, and to increase capacity, you put a little curve in, and this site was close to where that is. So we have a look at paragraph 10. Hopefully we've got that. We can see that the inspector said there's no dispute in general terms. The appeal site occupies a sustainable location, is suitable for the development proposal, appropriate use of the site in planning terms. The inspector identifies the principal issue as whether the appeal scheme could preclude delivery of the Camp Hill cord, that's the rail cord, and whether that would cause any prejudice to its delivery as a material consideration. Now, I happen to know that this case involved cross-examination by Sarah Reid on behalf of the appellant developer. And within 10 minutes, the council's witness for the local authority agreed that planning permission should be granted. So that's quite effective, isn't it? Very, I would say. Poor Gary Grant had to deal with the consequences. They came back the next day, insisting they still had a case to make, despite the fact that it should be granted planning permission. I wish I'd been there. I wish I'd been there. But what we should have a look at is the site. So I think we've got a little clip that shows where the site is, because really everything I can explain about their location is revealed in this video. So I'll just talk through the video, shall I? This is the site. As you can see, one of the finest architectural gems in the Birmingham area, and a collection of industrial buildings and proposed for development. And as it spins round, what you're looking behind the site is the Bawdsley Railway Station. And you'll see just in a minute how close to the city centre it is, because they're going to show you, Charlie, you'll recognise this. You're going to see the bull ring. Look at that. And the Selfridges building covered in bubble wrap. So look how centrally located that is. There's going to be no arguments about where you could walk in that case, is there? But it was so close to the rail line. There's always this concern about, will it potentially prejudice capacity on the railway line longer term? And the inspector's conclusion after hearing all this was, no, it wouldn't. And the real issue is that Network Rail didn't object. Sarah's clients consulted all the way through. Various different options were considered. I think 20 different options. And what they did, which was very smart, was on the only bit that might potentially be one of the 20 options, they put a surface level car park. So they moved their energy plant and put it elsewhere. So very clever manoeuvring by the appellants, advised by Sarah, so that they could achieve that. I think we've got a couple of images of the development because everybody wants to know what it looks like. There you go. That's what's happening in our cities. They're all going up. Rather than going out, they're going up, and that is exactly what the government wants. And if you ask me ahead of the elections, but before the purdah period, that is a statement by the government about how Birmingham can try and meet its need by significantly increasing the height of development. Now, my only observation about that is that that's great, and I'm all for that, but it delivers hardly any affordable housing. So there's a role for this type of development, but there's also a role for greenfield development that delivers affordable housing. And if we just have a look at the appearances, it's one final thing I just want to point out. Have a look at that. 2 of the barristers in this case are women. The inspector was a woman. The appellant's consultant was a woman. How often do we see the appellant in a combination of woman as the lead planning consultant and as the barrister as well? I've seen that a few times in my career against one Mary Cook, but it's very rare and we should see a lot more of it. And that's the future.
Well done.
Cheers, Chris. I must say, it's a good looking scheme too, isn't it? I think a nice use of green space too. Now, Paul, you're take us all the way up to Preston from Birmingham, and you're going to tell us about a big appeal decision from there.
No, we're not. You don't read your emails, Charlie. We've been emailing.
I do this every week, by the way. To be fair to me, the script said Preston, didn't we? We changed it.
No, it didn't. No, it didn't.
It's just funny.
That's every.
We'll be having words later. Can I just say on that past case, I was leading Sarah on that case. I couldn't do the inquiry. I'm delighted Sarah took it over, and it's certainly one that got away from me. But absolutely mega congratulations in terms of the team that ran that appeal. So
yeah, Paul, to be fair, to cross-examine and get that concession within 10 minutes.
I don't know. I couldn't have done that. First rate.
Yeah. So what we really need next week is a map, and I'm going to pin on the map which part of the country you're going to tell us about.
Well, I'm going to tell you all about Bicester.
That's it.
I'm going to tell you about a case in Bicester, and I'm going to take you for the first time in the show's history to the Technology and Construction Court, not somewhere we often go to. And I'm going to tell you about a striking out claim in front of Mrs. Justice O'Farrell. And it involves a scheme of sheltered accommodation for the elderly, which was built and run by Anchor Hanover. If Rob can just bring up, I don't know if you've got the photographs, Rob, to show what happened, but in December 2013, there was a flood. That's the scheme directly behind. The flood occurred in 2013. The permission had been granted in 2009. As a result of the flood, just before Christmas, all of the occupants of the ground floor had to leave. The occupants of the first floor were stranded. And subsequently, Anchor Hanover brought proceedings against a variety of parties who'd been responsible for the cause of the flood, which was a culvert, which was diverted to make way for the development, which had within it what's called a trash screen. Now, and why is that of any relevance to planning? Well, it's of relevance to planning for this reason, that the Environment Agency were part and parcel of the proceedings. The Environment Agency had discharged Condition 17 of the planning permission, which said prior to commencement of development, detailed designs of the proposed watercourse crossing shall be submitted to and improved in writing by the LPA. What they also did was when they were consulted on the discharge of conditions, they made particular reference to the fact that the trash screen within the culvert was smaller, had spaces smaller than it should have been. There were certain other things that had happened, because there was also consent under the Water Resources Act. But the Environment Agency, as part and parcel of the planning process, had recommended that the conditions be discharged. Well, of course, when the claimants then brought proceedings, they brought the Environment Agency in, alleging that there was a duty of care that had arisen for a number of different reasons, but this is one of them. The Environment Agency brought proceedings to strike out the claim insofar as it related to them, because they said the discharge of a statutory duty does not give rise to a duty of care. And Mrs. Justice O'Farrell gives an exemplary discussion as to the legal context in relation to that. But surprisingly, certainly on my first read of it, she didn't strike out the claim, because she did conclude that there are circumstances in which there can be a duty of care which arises from the exercise of statutory duty in certain circumstances. And the way that the case was pleaded in this case, she concluded, fell within one of those unusual circumstances where it did potentially, arguably, give rise to a duty of care, and she's allowed the case to proceed to a final hearing. That's important, because if that ultimately, and that's the case itself, if that ultimately is concluded against the Environment Agency, then that perhaps will sign a note of caution to all consultees in the way in which they respond to consultations. Although it is very unusual in terms of the circumstances of the case, because it's not the mere fact of the exercise of the statutory duty, it's got to be something over and above that. So it's one to watch, really, and it's an interesting case in any event. And it's nowhere near Preston, Charlie.
I tell you what, Paul, just you show you those photographs look just like Preston to me.
They're not pretty enough for Preston. You've not been.
And no, I haven't actually. I'm not going anytime soon either. Sasha, Shaftesbury Avenue, is that right?
Yeah, I am actually taking the world's greatest city. The only thing that's really amazed me so far is that Camp Hill building, the existing building, wasn't the Grade 1 listed building in the context of Birmingham, but there we go. I'm going to Shaftesbury Avenue. Well, Mary and I have got to keep the flag flying for the capital on this show. And I'm going to deal with Shaftesbury Avenue, which is, now this, I can tell you one thing for sure about this case. The LPA didn't throw in the towel after 10 minutes of cross-examination. You know how certain cases, the steam just rises off this inquiry. And this is one of those, hard fought over every inch. It was a bit like the Western Front in the First World War. And what this case revolves is the reuse of the old Savile Theatre, the former Savile Theatre, which is close to my heart because I researched it this afternoon. My father put a show on there in 1969. It was also owned by Brian Epstein, and those music lovers amongst us, i.e. Mary and Chris, will appreciate that it is effectively where the Beatles, the Rolling Stones and the Who performed in the 1960s. But anyway, the owners sought to develop it for a mixed-use scheme involving a hotel and, as you can see, hotel, restaurant use, and effectively a replacement cinema. And the building, as you can see, is an existing Grade 2 listed building. Now, notwithstanding the greatest efforts of Kit Kat to persuade the inspector, I think what this decision just absolutely resonates is the inspector just didn't like the scheme. He wasn't persuaded by particularly the decision, the proposal to put a 3-story roof extension on the top of the existing building. And however brilliant certain advocates are, you just get a sense that the inspector felt it would be harmful. And therefore, the conclusion reached was that there would be harm both to the listed building and the 2 surrounding conservation areas that lie in close vicinity. I also think what's interesting, there's a point for all the practitioners out there. There were counter cost claims against each other, both full and a degree of partial. And one of the things, again, that the inspector does actually give a partial award for the appellant against the council. And just for the practitioners, either side of the fence, the council wrote to Heritage England and asked them to reconsider, Historic England asked them to consider amending the listing in March 2020. The inquiry was in December. On the 4th day of the inquiry, it came to light that the local authority had done that, and it was news to the appellant. And the inspector held that it was incumbent upon the LPA to actually inform the appellant that this was happening. So the takeaway from this inquiry is, do be careful. Don't be, if you're involved leading up to an inquiry, there does need to be a degree of transparency and openness between the 2 sides. Otherwise, you do run the risk of costs. And Chris wanted to be in the inquiry venue at Camp Hill when the concession was made after 10 minutes. I wouldn't have minded being in this inquiry when Kit Kat found out that that there'd been this correspondence between the LPA and Historic England on day 4 of the inquiry. Anyway, that is Shaftesbury Avenue decision. Thank you, Charlie.
Brilliant.
But before I finish, I've just got to say, for a couple of people on, and this is with all my love, North London is red. Thank you.
Now, because we're going to do the second half of the show as a recording of the interview we've had with the Minister, we'll do Champion and Nudge of the Week now in advance. Chris, you're going to tell us who the Champion of the Week is.
Yeah, well, I've got a cheeky little champion first of all. If Rob can just bring up a photo, and that is, do you know who that is? Anybody?
Yes, she won the Gold Cup on Tuesday.
Yeah, she's from Preston.
Nearly. The Gold Cup's tomorrow. It should be, yeah, but put money on her if you know she won. for that money, that is Rachel Blackmore, who won a major race at the Cheltenham Festival and is looking set to possibly become the first champion jockey of jump racing. So she is phenomenal. Absolutely. AP McCoy says she's going to be the champion jockey this year. Amazing. That's all because I can hear the Cheltenham race. It's all going on with no spectators, but I can hear it. The whole of Cheltenham can hear it. How frustrating is it to hear the racing commentary and not actually go and see it? So anyway, the champion I wanted to make on a professional basis is the Planning Inspectorate, because I don't know if you noticed this, but on the 12th of March, they issued a notice just updating the position on coronavirus, and they are looking at the roadmap back to normality, and they are looking at how they can plan events so that they can be back to normal, and the huge backlog that has emerged that they are all working flat out to solve is something that they're looking at to get back to real events. And can I just say, I'm in an inquiry at the moment where the case officer is another inquiry. They are using all resources available to them to progress the inquiries, but the only way we're going to get to deal with the hearings is if we get back to normal events, and that should be June, hopefully, but that's up to Pins.
Fingers crossed, Chris. And Nudge of the Week, Sash.
Yeah, I'm going to be, in the interests of equality and fairness, I'm going to have nudge to the Planning Inspectorate as well, because I've noticed in the past 2 weeks, I've got 2 appeals, very large, one of them with 13 witnesses, the other one involving a development of 30 acres. And both times the inspector have initially said hearings. Remember, I've met the inspector who had the first hearing, 1978. Him, the architect and the LPA officer, to get to a position where appeals with 12 professional witnesses are going to be called and seriously contend it should be done by a hearing, in my judgment, is balmy and it's wrong. And we need inquiries on appeals of that significance and seriousness. So, and you'll see the context of this nudge in about 22 minutes' time.
And can I just say, I agree, I've had the similar experience, and we mustn't forget, it's very easy when faced with huge backlogs due to the pandemic to think, well, let's put as much through in the hearings so we can churn out decisions quickly. But remember what Bridget Rosewell said when she came on our show the first or the second time, that the targets were all about enabling development to happen more quickly. And there are some inquiries where the appellants want to have an inquiry, even if it means that there's a degree of delay, because the decision needs the degree of scrutiny that only an inquiry can give. And I think that's important to bear in mind. Anyway, on that note, we're going to say goodbye from the live show and go over to our pre-recorded discussion with the Minister. Before we go, please remember, next week is our final episode of season 3. We will be back for season 4, and we'll give you details of that in due course. We conclude the season with Fiona Howie, who's the Chief Executive of the Town and Country Planning Association. Moreover than that, she previously ran the campaign for national parks. And before that, she was the head of planning for CPRE. And we've been quite keen to get the sort of CPRE perspective as well on the show. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Fiona from all of her various perspectives, current and past. She'll be on this time next week. So with that, we will hope the technology works as it did with the Archbishop when we pre-recorded him. We'll say goodbye from us live, and you'll see the interview now. I hope you enjoy it. Well, we're delighted today to welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You, Chris Pincher, the Minister for Housing and Planning. Chris, thank you so much indeed for joining us. We're hugely grateful that you are able to do so despite the immense demands on your ministerial diary. The reaction from our viewers, from our posts about your joining us, have been overwhelming. And as you might know, we've asked our viewers to suggest some of the questions that we'll be asking you today. So the questions you're about to be asked represent a flavour of what people in the planning industry are particularly interested to hear from you.
Right, understood.
So I'm going to kick off, and my first question really is to ask you the question that you and the Secretary of State has asked everybody else in the Planning for the Future white paper, which is, what three words do you associate most with the planning system in England?
Opaque, Byzantine, slow.
Very good. I'm sure a number of our viewers would share that analysis, and we're really looking forward to seeing what the government's response to the Planning for the Future white paper consultation says about how to redress that situation. You obviously can't tell us what the response is going to say. I'd love to know. But can you at least give us a feel for when can we expect the government's response?
Well, I suppose I'm trained to say, Charlie, in due course when questions like that are put to me. But in all seriousness, we had 44,000 responses, a huge number of responses to a very important consultation, and they came from a wide variety of sources, as you would expect. Subsequent to that, by the way, we also held a very large number of engagements with all sorts of stakeholders, from planning professionals, developers, different shapes and sizes, environmental groups, even youth groups. So there was a lot really to consolidate. We're still working through those responses, but I think probably in the next few months, we should be in a position to pull it all together and to respond to what has been a very, very big consultation.
Thank you. And I appreciate you can't comment on what the response will be, but if it were to involve some form or other of a new regime for local plans, which obviously is a central pillar of the white paper, then obviously there would be a need in the years that follow for every local authority in England to prepare a new style local plan, and that would have a considerable impact on the planning inspectorate's resources. Because obviously every local plan would need at least one, in some cases two, inspectors to examine it, whilst the planning inspector would also continue to service planning appeals and other casework. And we know that even as things currently stand, PINs are struggling, understandably, with the demands of their caseload in the pandemic world. For example, hearings are taking about a year to go from start to finish in terms of the process. So in light of all of that, is MHCLG actively looking at increasing the planning inspectorate's resources to deal with current and indeed future pressures? And is there anything in particular specific you can share with us in this regard?
Well, that's a good question. I'm very keen to make sure that I stay close to the planning inspectorate, to PINs and the inspectors out there in the country doing great work under very difficult circumstances at the moment, to make sure that they've got the tools they need to do their job. So I'd say a few things. First of all, we have enabled PINs through the use of virtual tools and technology, through the use of hybrid approaches, to take a much more flexible approach to dealing with plans or other adjudications, which I think will help them both in the present emergency, but also beyond it in the new planning world that we envisage. I also think because of the way we want to streamline the planning system and plans themselves, being outcomes focused rather than iterative process focused tools, that should also help the planning inspectorate do its job. But we have said in the white paper, with I think specific reference to local authorities, that we will look at the entire panoply of resources that are available to planners to ensure that they have the wherewithal to take advantage of the toolkit we provide them with and the demands that we're making of them. And of course, I'll have conversations with PINs about that too.
And does that include potentially giving PINs more money, frankly, to deal with their pressures?
Well, I don't want to do the job of the Secretary of State, or indeed, heaven forfend, the Treasury, and start doling out money on Zoom calls. But I'll certainly make sure that we properly engage with PINs, consider their challenges and respond appropriately.
Thank you. And another resources question, but this time about local planning authorities. And one local planning authority head of planning, who's a regular viewer of this show, has asked us to ask you how you will ensure that local authority planning departments are fully resourced to deliver the development of all types, not just housing, that their areas need. And he comments, I'm quoting, he says, "This question is critical both in terms of the now in playing our role in the economic recovery post-COVID and in the future in terms of handling the transition to the new system." So again, from their perspective, what comfort can you offer them that they will have the resources they need?
Well, I want the planners of the future to have the ability to be strategic planners of their entire local authority geography rather than being tactical administrators of a piecemeal system. So we want to make sure that they've got the toolkit to do their job. So a couple of things. First of all, we've said that we will look at the fee approach and structure as it currently is configured to make sure it is fit for purpose. And as an example of that, we have already looked at permitted development right fee charge for upbuilding, for example, and increased it. And I'm doing this from memory now to I think it's £334 per unit application. But we'll look at the fee structure that's presently charged to see how that should work in the new regime. And we will look across the piece at the resources the planning departments may need to operate the new systems. But I also think, Charlie, that by streamlining the system, by making it far more digitalized and less, as it were, PDF bump driven, we will free up a lot of planners' time to do the job that they really want to do, which is to be strategic planners rather than administrators.
Thank you. Now, you're the Minister for Housing as well as Planning, and it would be remiss of me, therefore, not to ask you about the housing crisis and how the planning system can address that. And despite the repeated public statements by government in policy and outside of policy about the imperative need for planning to address the housing crisis, the success rate for housing-related planning appeals is a fairly grim read. I think it's still, in general terms, below 30%. Can I ask, therefore, what encouragement is the Ministry giving to the Planning Inspectorate and decision makers to give real meaningful weight to the delivery of new housing? And is there any particular message you'd like to convey directly to the PINS inspectors who are listening today? We get many of them amongst our viewers.
Well, PINS, of course, is an independent professional organisation that acts on behalf of the Secretary of State. So I don't want to tell them how to do their job. They know it perfectly well. But we are very clear that we have a housing challenge in our country. Whether you're, I don't know, KPMG or Shelter, two very different organisations, both say that in order to meet housing need, we've got to build north of 250,000 homes a year in our country. We very nearly did that last year, incidentally, where we built 244,000 new homes. This was pre-COVID. And we have an ambition to build 300,000 a year by the middle of the decade. So I think PINS understand that, and that needs to inform the planning, the local plans that are developed by local authorities and the way PINS adjudicates on them. So without trying to tell inspectors to do their job, we're very keen that we get good plans that illustrate where homes are going to be built, what kind of infrastructure should go with them, and get that in quickly, so that those plans get through the examination process effectively.
And on the same theme about delivering on the housing house building targets that government has set, one planning consultant who's amongst our viewers has asked us to ask you: is the government confident that you can reconcile the ambitious house building targets that you have with the burgeoning environmental agenda, such as nutrient neutrality, biodiversity net gain, zero carbon, and all the other important considerations on the other side of the balance? Can you strike the balance and still deliver the 300,000 homes a year target that government has set?
Well, we think we can. I mean, there is always what you might call creative tension between departments to achieve each individual department's objectives to meet the government's overall objectives. But for example, I'm working very closely with Rebecca Power at DEFRA, because DEFRA control the main levers around the challenge of nitrates and phosphates and nutrient neutrality. We've formed a task force to get that issue resolved, both in the short term to unblock some of the development stalls that we've seen, but also in the longer term with water treatment issues addressed. So I think that we can, with creativity, meet that challenge. And certainly with respect to the biodiversity net gain of 10%, which is in the Environment Bill, we're making sure that we pick that up and bake it into our planning considerations when it comes to our response to the White Paper and future planning reform legislation.
Thank you. And two of our viewers who are in the sector dealing with specialist housing for older people have asked questions along the following theme. They say, well, should local authorities in the government's view have a separate requirement for affordable housing and for specialist older people's housing, with the presumption, the tilted balance being engaged when considering those kinds of schemes if the authority can't demonstrate a 5-year supply of that particular kind of development, irrespective of the position in relation to housing generally? And they suggest, and are interested in your thoughts on this, that this might help deliver the right amounts of the right kinds of development. What do you think about that?
I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not going to commit myself chapter and verse to it, but for example, if you look at the AHP that we announced last September, in it there is provision for specialist housing, adaptable housing for disabled or potentially older and disabled living. So we have got that as part of our Affordable Homes Programme cash pot. But I'm particularly interested actually in older people's living and the opportunities that majoring on it can afford. I think there are fantastic health and mental well-being opportunities. I think generally speaking, older people want to live closer to services, so it means that you're going to build properties on brownfield sites closer to town centres where those services are, so you don't have to focus on greenfield as much. Generally speaking, older people prefer conservative sorts of properties. They look and feel, rather conservative, which generally means that the local community is more willing to see them built around them. And of course, I think it's true to say that whenever an older person moves from their existing, let's call it a 3-bedroom semi-home, into more appropriate designed accommodation, then 2 in every 3 moves result in the first-time buyer getting onto the property ladder 2 steps back down the chain, because it frees up the middle of the market. So I think there are lots of good reasons for focusing on older people's living, and without giving too much away at the moment, I'm alive to that challenge and we're working on it.
Watch this space. Last question from me before I open up to the panel. Chris, if there's one change to planning law or policy that you could make tomorrow, what would it be?
Oh, now there is a question. I thought I was doing so well.
You are.
One change that I would make, I tell you what it would be. It would be to get more people involved in the plan making and planning process, because right now, I think something like 3% of the local population get involved in a particular planning application. That falls to just 1% when it comes to local plan making. That's virtually the planning officers and their blood relatives getting involved in plan making, and we need to get more people in so that they have a stake in plan making, so that the system becomes less adversarial over time. So that would be the one change I'd like to make.
Thank you. Now, Mary, over to you for the first question from the panel.
Thank you very much. And if I may say so, Minister, I would definitely support that last aim. So my question, I notice you've mentioned strategic planners several times in your answers. My question is this: does the recently published introduction for the spatial framework for the Oxford-Cambridge Arc and the proposals for a regional growth body indicate an acknowledgement by government that intervention is required to ensure delivery of regionally important growth proposals in a joined up and timely fashion? Does it potentially indicate a return to strategic planning principles. And if I just may allow myself another question, are you offering financial support for joint strategic plans as another means of achieving something similar?
Two good questions, Mary. With respect to, well, first of all, in terms of the principle, if you step back and look at the challenge that we face when it comes to sub-regional developments and major infrastructure planning, it's clear that the duty to cooperate between individual local authorities doesn't work effectively. And we have to recognise that there are constraints on areas driven by economies or driven by geographies, which are not necessarily nicely drawn within a local government area boundary. Something that Peter Walker came up with 40 odd years ago does not necessarily map onto economic or geographic challenges or opportunities. So I think there is a role for those kind of spatial frameworks and economic growth bodies that fit into them. You're seeing that already with some of the mayoral combined authority work that we're doing. We will announce in the summer our vision for the spatial framework for the Oxcam Arc, which we'll consult upon. And that will allow us at the end of the year to develop some policies which fit into that consulted upon vision. So I think that there is a role for such cross-local authority boundary groups. And we'll see how well we do with the Oxcam Arc. In terms of, you asked the question, financial support. Well, again, I don't want to start throwing the Treasury's money around, but clearly, there will be MHCLG time and resource expended on the Oxcam Arc. We've got a team of professionals working on it with local authority leaders. Obviously, they'll be more engaged as we develop the spatial framework and the growth body proposals. So I'm sure that there will be support, but whether that means writing lots of checks to lots of people, that's a different question. I'll leave that to the Chancellor.
Vishy's calling right now. He's got to go and take his call.
You can see a hook pulling me left.
Paul, what's your question for Chris?
Yeah, firstly, it's a great pleasure to have you on, Chris, and the array of potential questions that occur to me in relation to asking questions of the Minister are huge. And what you did trigger when you mentioned the answer to Charlie's first question was, what on earth did I put as my 3 words at the very start? And so I went back to that and had a look, and I put overly reformed, commendable, and reformable, which I think is almost the obverse of the point that you put. So I feel slightly better now having read that. But my question follows on from Mary's, which is, in 2004, we abolished county planning for the English planning system, and it was replaced by regional spatial strategies, which was catastrophically Byzantine. And then in 2013, we removed regional planning, but we didn't reinstate strategic planning. But the message that I hear time and time again, not least in response to the question of what questions would you ask the Minister, is the removal of regional planning and the removal of strategic planning hasn't worked. It's an experiment that hasn't worked. So my question is somewhat of a blunt one, which is, why is there such visceral opposition on the part of governments, and this is governments of both political persuasions, to the notion of regional planning in England?
Because we still have, I think rightly, a very strong sense of local communities, which are bounded by local authority ties. We've reformed local authority boundaries down the years, but generally speaking, they still represent a cohesive community space. If you look at my local authority, or at least the biggest one, Tamworth is a small market town on the edge of what used to be the North Warwickshire coal belt, and it's got a very strong sense of community, and its council reflects that. And therefore, we want to make sure that those local authorities and the local plans they generate remain the bedrock of the planning system. That said, as I said to Mary, we have to recognise that there are constraints and opportunities which cannot fall within the boundaries of one local authority, even sometimes a first tier authority. You know, if you've got a big national park or area of outstanding natural beauty in your local authority, you've got some constraints, but you've still got to make sure that the people who live in other places in that local authority have got homes to live, and you've got to work with a wider range of communities to make sure that the right level of dwelling space and infrastructure to support it is available. So there's a role, I think, for that overarching infrastructure, if you like, but we must base planning fundamentally on local authorities, because that's, I think, a very strong public steer that we've got, and it's what we're going to do.
So does that mean that there's a smarter role for more targeted strategic type planning of the Oxcam ARC approach?
I think there is, and working with local communities, the local leadership of those communities, and I don't just mean local authorities, but I mean, you know, third sector organisations, businesses as well, is the way to build that community of economic interest, which also, of course, includes housing.
Thank you.
Chris, your question to other Chris.
Thank you, Charlie. Good afternoon, Chris.
Good afternoon, Chris.
I'm a huge fan of Tamworth, I have to say. I'm the Brummie here, and I love Tamworth because of your snow dome. It's just fantastic, although we haven't been near it for a while, of course.
Saying that, Chris, does not give you a free pass. You've still got to pay the £12.50 to get in and use it.
Yeah, okay, all right, I understand that. And just on Charlie's point, actually, about the housing crisis, I think some of us sometimes feel that appeal decisions and other decisions are made a little bit in a vacuum. I've only ever seen one appeal decision where an inspector has referred to the housing crisis. And yet, probably because they feel they can't really talk about it in those terms because it's not in national policy. So just an observation, not really a question, is whether national policy could reflect the reality of the situation, which is that we are in a housing crisis. Build is great, but you know, recognizing it's a crisis, I think would be a step forward. But my question is about housing. Everybody knows it's always about housing, but housing can be released in the Greenbelt under exceptional circumstances in local plans. It's not that the Greenbelt can't be built on, it can. And the High Court has made clear that the phrase exceptional circumstances can be met by a single factor, and that ordinary housing need is not precluded from the scope of exceptional circumstances. That's the Guildford High Court case. Now, given that, why is it that some authorities like Birmingham, like Bradford, Coventry, Cheltenham will release land in the Greenbelt to meet their ordinary housing needs? But you also allow other authorities, including many in London, not to do so. And sort of saying, well, it's local choice, I would suggest lets too many people down in the context of a housing crisis. There needs to be real leadership to local authorities to tell them that unless you can find somebody else to meet your need, then you must meet your identified housing needs. Otherwise, we've got no prospect of tackling a housing crisis, really, if we just keep dodging the needs. So my question is the government thinking about this, and will it show leadership consistently about the way in which housing needs need to be met, even if that's in the Greenbelt, like many authorities already do?
Well, with respect to the NPPF, first of all, Chris, I wouldn't want to write fixing the housing crisis into the NPPF on the basis that we will fix it and there will at some point not be the sort of challenge that we face. But I recognise the value of what you say, which is we've got to have a mission, and that's got to be baked into the system. And I certainly want to try to make sure that, you know, using appropriate language, we do that. With respect to the Greenbelt and local authorities doing what they need to do, build out in the places that they can. We've said in our manifesto, and we're absolutely committed to it, the Greenbelt as a means of preventing urban sprawl is something that we want to retain, and so do local authorities and local people. It is for local authorities to decide if they are going to take out land from the Greenbelt for use in exceptional circumstances for development, because they should be focusing primarily on brownfield and non-Greenbelt designations. We've given them tools with which to do that, like, for example, the PDR changes that we've introduced to allow more gentle densification, so regulatory change. We've also provided the financial wherewithal in places like mayoral combined authorities. You mentioned Birmingham. I'm not going to talk about their individual plans, but in terms of the support we've given to the mayoral combined authority, we've provided over £100 million of brownfield remediation funding to focus on providing the homes that people need in Birmingham. So our expectation in the local housing need methodology that we announced at the end of last year is that the 20 biggest cities in our country need to up their game, build more homes. They need to build them within their own boundaries, focusing on brownfield and other designations. And where necessary, they need to cooperate to deal with the challenges beyond their boundaries. That's also why, by the way, we're looking to reform the present duty to cooperate, because we don't think it works effectively. So I would say I think we have given them the tools to do the job. Their job now is to get on with it.
Just on that fairness point, though, do you think if some authorities can do it, there should be in a sense in which the government should say, well, if some can do it, why can't everybody do it?
Well, it's a fair challenge. I think that there are some really good authorities which lead the way, and I'm certainly, as a minister, very keen to point those out to other authorities to say, you can do the same. My general approach is to use more carrot than stick. I tend to find incentives work better than penalties, but there are a range of resources available to us, and we're prepared to use them as and when necessary.
Sasha.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chris.
Hello, Sasha.
My question's in relation to the mode of determination. I mean, as you can imagine, 5 planning barristers, we're involved daily on the mode of appeals, and obviously the importance of the appeal process. One of the huge frustrations we have is that PINS is currently determining many large appeals, choosing to make them hearings rather than inquiries, which is the very strong preference of our clients. Would you consider giving the appellant the right, again, as they used to have for many years, the right to determine the mode of determination of a planning appeal?
Well, thanks, Sasha. I'll reflect upon that latter point, but I would say that we have, as a result of the pandemic, but we want to make sure these tools are available and used effectively beyond it. Provided PINS with the technological toolkit and the regulatory flexibility to approach adjudications in the way most appropriate to deal effectively and speedily with that adjudication. So what I will do is to look closely at how those tools are operating and whether they're delivering. And of course, if they're not, in consultation with PINS, we can look to see what further action we can take to make sure they can do their job effectively, but also to make sure that all the other players in the system get the results that they need, by which I mean an outcome, as rapidly as possible.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm going to be cheeky and ask one final question of my own, in addition to the audience question, about town centres, something I've been working on quite a lot in the last few days. I mean, even before the pandemic, we all know the immense pressures on retail and other town centre users for all sorts of reasons. The pandemic obviously has created even more problems, and many shops won't reopen, etc., and so on. And there's huge pressures for change of use to residential and other uses, and some of which, of course, have been deregulated recently. Do you think there's more that the planning system could do to ensure that town centres don't end up becoming sort of sterile dormitories and retain their vitality and viability?
Well, potentially. I think what we'll want to do is to see how our reforms, which have either just been instituted or are in train, work, and what the outcome of the pandemic is. I mean, I think we have to recognise that the Amazon effect was already changing the way our town centres look and feel. And you can argue that, out-of-town shopping centres did that 20 or so years ago. Even they are feeling the pain now of Amazon. So the problem in town centres themselves has been exacerbated, and it's been exacerbated still further by the COVID emergency. So what we need to do is to make sure that those places become places where people still want to be, whether they're shopping for retail or whether more likely they're using them as leisure spaces, or better still, they're using them also to live in, so they can buy stuff in those places and use the services in those places more effectively. So that's why we brought together a suite of PDR-related tools to make use class switching much more easy between services, so the new service class, to make it easier to switch from commercial into residential where appropriate and with safeguards. Let's see how those tools work, as well as the funds that we've made available with things like the Future High Street Fund and the Towns Fund. Let's see how they work and then readdress the issue if there is still one. But I think that package is pretty strong.
Thank you very much. Well, Chris, you've been hugely generous with your time, but you've also been extremely generous with your answers, I may say so too. Lots of really interesting stuff. And going back to what you said about the one
is that a do come again, Charlie, or is it thank you very much? We'll call you.
Words out of my mouth. You must be psychic. Absolutely. No, please do. I mean, obviously, we'd be delighted if you were to come on again. No, particularly perhaps when you've got some news to share with us about what the future direction of the planning industry looks. So please do consider. I hope you've enjoyed it. We certainly have.
I have. Thanks very much. I'm happy to come back again. Pleased to hear I passed the first audition and I'm down to the final 3.
Absolutely.
See you in a few months' time when you may even hear my singing voice.
Now, there's a challenge.
You want to go to 50 houses, make sure you go to Sasha's.
Thank you very much again. Really appreciate it. And please stay in touch. Cheers.
Good to speak to you all. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.